Yeah? Okay, great. A wonderful example of the joy of organised storage. The cameraman has somewhere that it will live, so apologies for the delay. Today I wanted to pick up on the stuff that we talked about last week and talk a little bit about the theory of constraints, which is some of the tools in the theory that we can use around workflow design, and in particular around how we identify and manage. I have a slide that says that. And the purpose, just to remind you of the workflow work, is kind of twofold. There are two big purposes really. One is to help us increase the efficiency with which we can work, right? But the other is also to expand the scope of our self-management. So to move from just controlling the work that's in front of us to controlling how the work comes to us. Let's not forget that, we say self-management, right? Management traditionally is a separate discipline. So there are sort of two senses of self-management. One is that you're managing yourself, and the other sense is that management, the function that's traditionally separated off in a business, is distributed across everybody. So things like looking at the workflow and how it's working is stuff that in the end point of self-management, everybody is involved in. The aims of this talk in particular is just to begin to provide some common tools of a vocabulary so that we can work together on this. I'm not providing any answers today. I'm just trying to frame the questions that we might want to ask and how we approach them. And it's important to say that work on this is very much already happening, right? So we are working on workflow. We are increasing the capacity of bottlenecks and things like this. This is just formalizing it and helping us get better at it. So there's also tied in with that aim is systems thinking. Right? A system is a whole consisting of interacting parts. And in many ways, actually, a system maintains its existence through that interaction. So, the point of interaction is that the parts can affect each other, their outputs and their behaviors and their states. And systems tend to have this thing called emergent properties, right? That's one of the interesting things that comes out of the interaction. Systems have features which are greater than the sum of their parts. That's kind of tied up in that definition. So, depending on your point of view, like some good examples, some sort of organic examples, are digestion, right? Digestion is an emergent property of a system of cells in your body. It's not any of the individual cells that add up to or that contain the ability to digestion, but a coordinated group of cells working together give the ability to digest things. Depending on whether or not you're like a Cartesian dualist or a hardcore materialist, you might also see consciousness as an emergent property of the system. That our brains, a collection of cells, are sufficiently become a sort of a system that has sufficient computational power that consciousness begins to arise. If you remember last week, we touched on the fundamental attribution bias, which says that problems are often best solved at a system level, but we tend to blame individuals. Right? And that's often because individuals are in front of us and the system is hidden. So the advantage of having tools to help you interact with the workflow and look at how to improve the workflow is it guards against that. And it's also more of a teal perspective. Right? One of the things that happens in teal, in open culture, whatever you want to call it, is that we start to embrace a system perspective on a whole load of problems. So getting into the kind of mental habit of stepping back and not just seeing the features that are in front of us, but starting to look at the system that surrounds them and how we might operate on that is a really useful set of thought skills. So today in particular, I'm talking about the theory of constraints. This is a theory that is introduced in this it's kind of a novel called The Goal. It's like a textbook in the form of a novel by this guy, Eliyahu Goldblatt. And it's basically an application of fluid dynamics, right? Now, for those of you who've studied physics, there's some truths in fluid dynamics that are quite counterintuitive, so we'll come on to those in a second. But the crucial thing that we're looking at here is kind of flows and how flows behave, and in particular the way that the interaction dependency and variability affect flows. So that allows us to find and exploit bottlenecks. So this is how it's an application of fluid dynamics. Why are the traffic jams? Right? This is a really fascinating video. I love this. So here is a group of cars. Everybody's moving at a consistent speed. So this is the whole system, right? There's a consistent rate of flow across the whole thing. Now, in a second, one of these cars towards the front here is going to slow down. right? So now, what's happening here, this guy slows down, this guy slows down, so suddenly we're starting to get this pile up here, this traffic jam is forming, right? So nobody's actually stopping, there's no accident, but yet we're starting to see increasingly a traffic jam. Right, now what's happening here is the interaction of variance and dependency. Because we have a series of chained events, right, each of the cars is moving, and each of the cars is moving with an average speed. Now at the beginning, they were all moving at the same speed, so everybody has the same speed, and the variation is zero. Everyone's maintaining that consistent speed. But in reality, we know that when we have a mean average, we have an average rate of speed for a particular car, there's variation on either side. Perhaps it's a normal distribution, right? Now, the thing that happens here is because these things are not independent, right? In the case of the cars, it's a single lane road. They can't pass each other. So you have the one car in front that's going to vary across its normal distribution around the mean, but sometimes it's going to be slower. Right? Now, if you're the car behind that, you're going to be varying as well. But in order for you to maintain the mean average that you're capable of, you need to be able to go faster at some times and slower at other times. But your ability to go faster is limited by the fact that the person in front of you might be in a phase where they're going slower, right? And it's a single track road, so you can't overtake them. So what that means is, where you have a series of events that have variation and are interdependent, and we can think of cars on a single track road as being interdependent in this way, they're a sort of linked chain. What tends to happen is that you get a much slower average overall than the average that the system is capable of, because you have a skewing towards the slower half, because when processes that are downstream want to go faster, they're held up by the process in front, right? So this is turbulence. Turbulent flows are slower flows, smooth flows are faster flows. So with the traffic, the counterintuitive solution, right, for those of you who've been on the M25 or whatever, is lower speed limits. Those variable speed limits when traffic starts to get heavy actually means that traffic moves slower and we prevent traffic jams. And now I was going to have another, where did I put it? Another good example of this. Okay, so this is actually the example from the book, The Goal. So what we have is a game here where everyone is going to roll a dice, and then they can move forward up to that many pieces to the next person around the table, right? But you can only move forward as many pieces as you have available to them. Okay, so this is a kind of a simulation of a very simple manufacturing process where a series of pieces of raw material are put in at this end, come out at this end, and they're passed from workstation to workstation. Now, what you might think is that the average the score that will come up on any throw of a dice is 3.5. So, but it has variation. So what we're going to expect to see here is that you'd sort of instinctively think, okay, well, if the average is 3.5, then we sort of expect that over 10 rolls we'll have moved forward 35 pieces of work. But what we'll find out is that it doesn't happen like that, because right? So you can see that everybody started out with some, and then we moved the whole load forward. Now, we roll again. Yeah, so here we can see the problem starting to happen. Right, this guy's rolled 5, so he has the capacity to move forward 5 pieces of work, but he's only got 2 available to him because the process upstream of him was slower. So we can, as we start to roll, move, we'll just get to 10 turns and we'll see how many pieces we manage to get through. So we can already see bottlenecks starting to emerge in the system, right? Processes which are struggling to keep up with the demand. So actually, we've not done badly over. So over 10 moves, we thought that we might be able to push 35 pieces through the system, right? 10 times the average move, and actually, we were able to get through kind of 25. So we've ended up under capacity. Anyway, a little illustration there of how this works. Let me swap these. Okay, hopefully you can see. Hopefully they can see now. That should be working. Okay, so there's a question about how we handle this, right? And the way that we can do that is, through constraints. So, what is a constraint, right? This is the theory of constraints. A constraint is something that restricts the throughput of a system, right? And any system, the throughput of that system is determined by, this is the theory anyway, one constraint. Now, there might be a small number, but the theory says we could basically work with the idea of one. And the reason for that is, okay, we know that every system has to have a constraint. Because otherwise, we could just increase the throughput of a system infinitely without having to increase the resource available. And we know that we can't scale the output of a system infinitely without putting in more resources to do the work, right? We know that instinctively. And we also, if you think about it, can sort of work out that there's really probably only one or a very small number of constraints. Because if you imagine that we start with a system where demand is low, so we're always able to supply the demand. Every process is operating under its maximum capacity. And then what we're going to do is we're going to turn the volume knob up on demand, slowly, slowly, slowly. So each of the processes is going to gradually start to get towards the capacity. There's always going to be one that hits full capacity first. And that process, whichever bit it is the constraint or the bottleneck in that system. Now, if a system is a totally free system, then which means that as it stands currently, you're sort of in that first situation where supply is your ability to supply is greater than demand. Then in that case, we say that the constraint is external, so the constraint is the market. And actually, the techniques that you use to manage an external bottleneck are quite similar to the ones that you use to manage an internal one, a process-driven one. But we'll come back to that a little bit later on. Once a bottleneck hits its capacity, it cannot increase. Okay? And bottlenecks are the process, by definition, that are operating at their capacity. They're restricting the throughput of the whole process because they're operating at 100%. They need to operate at 100% to try and meet the market demand. And it may be that even operating at 100%, they're not able to adequately meet the market demand. Now, all the other processes, by definition, are not bottlenecks, because this is the one that has hit capacity first, right? So the other ones all have more capacity. So if we think about it, right, thinking about the dice game and how that works, if we have in the middle the place that's most restricted, what we expect to see is a stack up of work in front of that bottleneck, right? Because all the processes leading into it have spare capacity. They're all able to deliver more than they need. So there is and again, bear in mind that a lot of this theory was developed around manufacturing, but it does work for like knowledge work. But broadly speaking, the more work in progress you have, the less cash you have. Right? Every piece of work that you start but you don't finish is, in a manufacturing sense, it's raw materials that you convert into something that isn't ready for sale. In a knowledge work context, it's time that you're spending on something that's not yet to the state that you can invoice the client for it. So we want to try and reduce work in progress in order that we can more effectively manage our cash. There's also another point which doesn't fit into the theory of constraints, but is worth thinking about on a future occasion, which is that the more pieces of work you have in progress in a system, like the higher the cost of maintaining that volume of work, right? So Kanban systems, which are used in Toyota and Lean and so on, exist to restrict the amount of work that can go into a system at any one time. I mean, you can probably think in terms of your own workload, right? Think about maybe the the tax credit stuff. You know, if you've got, you know, 5 claims open, you probably know what they are. Maybe you don't even need to write it down. You just know what they are. You know where they all are. If you've got 50 claims open, it's more taxing in terms of time to manage that workload because you have to do more record keeping because you're picking them up and putting them down and so on. But it's also more taxing psychologically because you're going to have task switching between, you know, context switching between those things. So there are several good reasons why you want to try and restrict work in progress and have a smoother flow through the system. One of the things that's counterintuitive here, right, is that just increasing the capacity overall, which is sort of what we do because in some ways, you know, let's say client managers on tax credits are skilled across the whole process. So every time we add a person, we're adding capacity both to bottleneck and non-bottleneck processes, right? You know, and the other thing is that so increasing capacity overall doesn't necessarily improve the throughput of the system, because you might just continue to get a build-up of work in progress in front of your bottleneck. And local optimization may not lead to better throughput either. So this is a lot of what the goal focuses on is the kind of traditional thinking around manufacturing and saying, okay, you know, we have these series of workstations within a plant, and the traditional way of managing that is to try and make each of those workstations as efficient as possible. But again, what you do when that happens is you get this massive build-up of work in progress because all of the non-bottleneck stations have become super efficient, but they're operating at a pace faster than the bottleneck can work. A better way of looking at the efficiency of a workflow overall is to think about this, which is called Little's law. So inventory equals throughput times flow time. So what that means is if you have 5 pieces of work in a system, and each piece of work takes, let's say, 10 days to go through, because I'm going to get there. So and the flow time is the total time that it takes you end to end to service a piece of work. Then you. Oh, this is difficult. I forgot that.
Is it the number? Is it the number of pieces of work?
So the inventory is the number of pieces of work that you have in the system, and the flow time is the total time that it takes. And essentially, what this shows you is that you can. Every time you put in more inventory, every time you put in work in progress, assuming that the flow time continues to remain the same, then oh no, I can't remember the details. No, let's forget that I ever said that. I'll come back to that next week, or I will follow up with an email that explains that with a proper example. I had a cunning idea earlier, which was, I might bring up that little portable whiteboard and draw a diagram, but then I didn't have time. So I'm sorry about that, forget that. What was that slide? How do we measure constraint? Okay. So, I was saying that work in progress will stack up before a bottleneck unless we manage the speed of the process. But the beauty is, because we know every process has a constraint, right? Every process has a bottleneck, we can actually use that to our advantage. And like the example with the traffic jam, like the example with the variable speed limit on the M25, we can use that constraint, the capacity of the bottleneck process, to set a constant speed across the whole workflow, which will give us a smooth flow from end to end and will mean that we're not building up work in progress. Now, just to sort of start to frame some of the GrantTree specific questions for us, I think this is really interesting. Because we have people who are skilled across multiple stages of the process, understanding where the bottlenecks currently are allows us to effectively allocate our time. So if there's one stage of the process which emerges, as we start to look at this as a clear bottleneck, right, work is piling up in front of it, then we can say, well, this should be the priority stage. We should spend more of our time on this stage rather than on another part of the workflow. So how you manage work in progress, how you manage a workflow efficiently under the theory of constraint is that you set a constant speed. You ensure that the bottleneck process is used as much as it can be, right? And You only release new work into the system at the rate that the bottleneck is processing it. And this process, right, these three principles of working at constant speed, maximizing the use of the bottleneck, and releasing new work at that pace, is known rather fancifully as drum, buffer, and rope. This is the beginning of a whole series of sort of slightly hilarious three-letter acronyms. So please just bear with me. I'm afraid that this is from a sort of, I don't know, these guys really started work on this in the 80s, and I think that they were of a generation where if it didn't have a three-letter acronym, you couldn't sell it to somebody, you know? So, drum, buffer, and rope is part of a broader strategy, which is called exploit, subordinate, and elevate. Right, so what this says is that, which in turn is part of a broader strategy called the process of ongoing improvement. Actually, let's do it this way around. The process of ongoing improvement basically says, to improve a workflow, the first thing you need to do is to find the bottleneck. Then you run this routine of exploit, subordinate, and elevate. And you keep running that routine until the constraint is broken, which in the jargon of the theory of constraints means that it's no longer the constraint. So either you've got to the point where you have the market as your constraint, or another process becomes an internal bottleneck. And you know, so you find the next constraint and then you repeat, right? That's the process of ongoing improvement. So there's an interesting parallel for system design geeks between the theory of constraints and Lean and the Toyota improvement kata, which are this commitment to the process of ongoing improvement. There's recognition that your workflow, that your assembly of whatever it is that you sell to people as a product or a service is a system. And that systems are dynamics, right? They're interacting parts and they behave in ways that are not necessarily the logical sum of the individual bits. So that means that you have to, they're not static, you don't just set them up and leave them, they're constantly changing, you constantly have to be surveying them and going around and saying, where is the problem now and what can we do to fix it? So this exploit, subordinate, elevate strategy, generally speaking, what people do is they go straight to elevate. You say, we have a problem with the throughput of our workflow. We have a problem with the rate at which stuff is being sent to clients. We're not able to service the demand of the market. So our solution is to add new resources, right? Which might mean hiring new people, or it might mean training existing people to be able to handle other parts of it. But this is where people jump. Actually, you should start by exploiting and saying, are we making the best use of the resources we have? So that would mean saying, you know, what's the bottleneck of this work and how can we get people to prioritize it? And then the second thing, the subordinate, which is the process of saying, can we make the flow smooth, right? So work in progress isn't piling up. And then finally, we talk about adding new resources. So drum, buffer, and rope, right? Why it has this slightly fanciful name. So there's one really inherently confusing thing about this diagram, which is that in the metaphor, we're going to talk about a group of people who are walking this way. But in the actual work process, we're going to talk about workflow that's coming this way. It works this way, it doesn't work the other way around. If you imagine, so we've got these soldiers who are marching, and this is like the cars that we were looking at earlier, right? We sort of know now that the best way to get the whole group of people, the whole system, all of the work that we're trying to service from beginning to end, is for them to move at a consistent pace and for stuff not to get caught up in front of a bottleneck. So that means that we have a drum. If this guy here is the slowest person in the group, then what we want is for him to be banging a drum at the speed at which he's walking, so that everybody else is walking in sync with him and work is flowing through smoothly. We also want to make sure that, you know, these people, that means that these people behind him aren't going to kind of come and collide with him, but how do we, and to some degree their steps are going to be regulated, their ability to, you know, like the size of their stride is going to be regulated by where he is and the fact that he's physically in front of them. But these people could be taking strides in line with the drum, but yet they could disappear off in the future because they could be taking long strides. So we have a rope which makes sure that the front of the line stays consistent. This is the most efficient way to get all of these people from one side of wherever it is they need to go to the other. Right? We could imagine that, if we took away these things, one piece of work at the front might get there faster, but the whole system of work won't. So, looking at it from a process point of view, what this means is we have work coming in here, and we have the rope, which is a mechanism which says we're only going to put work in here at the point at which it's coming out here. So we have this, this kind of gating mechanism, which means that we're not putting too much work into the upstream process. Then we're going to have the drum, which is a scheduling of the bottleneck process, right? So that the bottleneck is always in use, and we know that the work is being fed through into the system so that it meets the bottleneck at the point at which it needs to in order to be delivered at the time that it's needed. And then we have the concept of the buffer, which is the time that it takes work to get from the front of the workflow to the bottleneck. Now the buffer is kind of the most interesting part of this process. And one of the things that, one of the kind of rules of thumb of applying theory of constraint is however long it currently takes a piece of work to get from the start of the workflow to the bottleneck, you can probably reduce that by half just by applying this process of buffer management. And the reason for that is that you have work that's waiting quite a lot of the time. Or alternatively, you can set up the kind of length of that buffer by saying, how long does it actually take to service this piece of work and then multiply it by 3. Now again, these are broadly rules of thumb from physical manufacturing, so we may find that they don't apply, but I'm sharing with you the knowledge that I have at the moment. Right, so we have this period of time that says, let's say it's 5 days from when work is released to when it arrives at the buffer. There is a difference between buffer and slack, which I like because they're actually both apps as well. Yeah, so you want most of your work to deliver 90-95% of your work to deliver in those first two zones. And then the final zone, the red zone, is basically your slack. So 5 to 10% of the work is going to get finished in there, but you're expecting most of the work to have got done by that point, by let's say day 6 out of 9, and to be sitting in front of the bottleneck waiting. So the bottleneck is always in use. The bottleneck is never turning around, ready to work, and there's nothing to work on. And you put buffers everywhere you have a bottleneck, but you also put them, you put one buffer at the end of the process, and you also want to have buffers at the point at which you have a convergence. So there's a little bit here which says that there are different types of plant. There are diverging workflows, which are V plants, converging workflows, which are A plants, straight workflows, which are I, and then T, but T is really just kind of an I and then an I and then a V. Yes, covered that. Oh yeah, so in terms of the way that we work, there's an extension to this theory which is called critical chain project management. And this is critical chain project management, not critical path project management. And it basically says, like a project is like an A plant. It's a workflow in which you have a series of processes which come together overall to make your finished product. So that means that you're going to have, every time 2 different work streams come together, you're going to have a buffer, and you're going to have a buffer at the end. So there's stuff in this which is a little bit like the traditional scheduling of projects, which is that you say, what do I expect on average each of these processes is going to take, and then you stack each of the bits of work backwards from the delivery deadline. And then you look at the ways in which when the different chains have to meet, so that you end up with a date where you have to start, right? And what you do then is that you add a 50% buffer to each independent chain, or another approach is that you make 2 estimates of each task and how long they're going to run. One is how long you think it's going to take on average, and another is the longest that you reasonably expect it's going to take. So 80% of the time you expect it to be done by then. and you make the buffer out of the sum of the differences of those items in the chain. We can work through more examples of this in the future. But this also ties into simplified DBR, which is a process where you just have one buffer at the end, and this works best where the constraint on the process is the demand of the market. And here you just have one buffer at the end, one schedule, which is a series of dates on which things have to be delivered, and from that, a series of dates on which you expect things are going to have to be started. And you don't worry about internal constraints. You don't worry about trying to identify whether there's a bottleneck process inside the system, unless you're consistently getting more than 10% of work landing at the end, or looking like it's going to land at the end, in the final third of the buffer that sits right at the end of the process, in that red zone. Some other topics, I mean, again, this was another kind of information dump, but to go back to the aims of the talk, I'm trying to provide some common vocabulary and tools and knowledge so that we can start to work on this. There's no value if I sit around learning this and reading up on it and holding on to that knowledge for a long time. So I'm sort of experimenting with sharing this stuff quite early. As you saw with Little's Law, there's still quite a lot of stuff I don't understand, in order that maybe it piques your interest, or maybe it starts to inform some of the work which you're going to get involved in. I'm going to keep learning on this. I'm going to be around to talk about it, but if it intrigues you, I will link to some resources. There's a really nice website which explains all of the theory of constraint stuff with much nicer diagrams than me. And I'll turn that out for the people in the culture channel with their presentation. A couple of things that tie into this. Throughput counting and cost of delay. So buffer management, right, this way of saying how do we make sure that work is moving through smoothly, how do we make sure that the bottleneck processes are always used as best we can, has those three zones. It is about prioritizing stuff that starts to land in the red zone so that we make sure that things work doesn't get delayed, and that the bottleneck is always in use. Throughput accounting and cost of delay are ways of saying if we have two pieces of work of equal time urgency, they're both sitting in the same place in the buffer inside the red zone, which of those pieces of work do we pick up? And it helps us understand some of the stuff around the way in which work is valuable to us. It is also, and that's part of the theory of constraints, so it's tied into it. And it's also tied into the related, apparently that's where I finished that sentence. The related workflow stuff in Kanban, which I mentioned earlier, which is similar to this. Okay, I think that's all the talking that I'm capable of doing. And anyway, it's the final slide. I'm sure it's, Any questions? Daisy?
Not really a question, but I think listening to that, the tough thing is that for us, because it's a service rather than a product, it's so much dependent on the client for getting stuff to us that I think this sort of diagram that Jeff has done, if this sort of materialises sometime soon, it could be really good with helping us pick up tasks equally to keep things moving at the right pace. So I think that ties into this. But when it comes to taking on new pieces of work, because it's a service, we want to do it for the client as quickly as possible, and if they don't see us start it for 2 weeks, then they're going to be upset about that. So I think that's why I think it's really useful to know all the things that you've just spoken about, but applying it to a service rather than a product is going to be the tricky bit.
Absolutely right. The theory is great, and it's a little bit baffling at first, but it kind of starts to sink in. You think, I could work with that. And then the interesting question is, how do we apply this to the situation that's really in front of us? Because no situation is ever the same as the textbook, right? Everything is always a little bit more messy, and how does it work? And there are interesting ways, I think, in which this can apply. So we could say, okay, well look, there is a value to us in putting work in progress into the system, at least in having contact with the client, because that's an expectation that they have. So we might expect to see work in progress stack up here, even though it's not really in front of a bottleneck. But there might still be things where we could say, do we have at the moment stages between work, places where work is kind of routinely put down, that actually we could merge into one stage, right? So if we think of the other kind of, the other thing which I mentioned today, Kanban, and that idea that the more pieces of work in progress we have as an individual, and hence as a system, you start to see decreases in efficiency because of the cost of holding and maintaining and the information around that volume of work. Right? We can say, okay, well, there might be an external reason that we can't do anything about that means that we do need to put in a high volume of work, but can we maintain that? Can we manage that better? So rather than have high volumes building up across the whole system, are the places where we can say, well, there's going to be a high volume here, but what we're going to do is we're going to rethink the way that work flows from there, so that, after this is the theory of the 1, 2, 3 process, is that, we kick off the meeting and then we have everything that we need and we can just go, and ship it straight to HMRC at that point. And the question is, well, look, if that isn't happening and work in progress is therefore stacking up in other places, what can we do? Do we need to rethink the way that we're doing 1, 2, 3? Is this stuff that we can do? And I recognise that people say, look, we say to the client, we're going to need all of this stuff, and they don't always provide it. Absolutely. But there are still things that we can do. This is really a tool for saying, where do we want to focus innovation? If we're not getting through the volume of work that we want to get through, the answer might not be just to increase capacity end to end. There might be something of a middle ground where we can say, actually, this appears to be the place. And if it is the stuff from the client, how can we do things like redesign the way that we interact with clients? How are the experiments that we're starting to run around tools that we're sending to the client for self-service? Can we accelerate those because we recognise that actually the constraint on us getting through the work is there? And then what we should do is focus on breaking that constraint rather than just increasing capacity across the board.
And I think, as you said before, visibility over the whole process, which this would give, that would help us as well get over the bottlenecks without having to get more people on board.
Yeah, and it allows us to do that piece of buffer management, to see, which of these pieces of work is starting to go into the red zone, which of these pieces of work is starting to get into that thing where we're worried that we might not be able to complete it on the date. And that allows us to, smooth the workload a bit more, to have kind of fewer instances where it's like, oh no, it's the end of the month and there's a panic, right? It puts us more in control of the work, even recognizing that the rate at which it comes in is not within our control because it's to do with, things like client signing and their response time. Somebody else had a comment.
Oh no, I was going to have a comment, but it was exactly what they said.
Great minds think alike.
Yeah, but I think what we've been doing in terms of the bottleneck is trying to relieve that at the moment is just a lot of communication, but like Dave said, once that is up and running, we'll be able to see what everything's going on. But at the moment, the bottlenecks are starting to slow down as much, but it's going to be mainly at the beginning process in terms of the data collection.
So at the moment, we have a sense that it's the waiting for stuff from the client that's the bottleneck. But what interests me is to say, well, let's look at it. And if it is, what else might it be like? The more that we start to own and understand and operate on the workflow, the better that we can get, and the more pleasurable the work becomes.
Just because it's topical, one of the things that is interesting in the process and bottleneck removing is the idea of working with accountants as partners in terms of our biggest bottleneck being chasing. Is if we work with people where we've taken that bottleneck for us and effectively giving it to someone else who's, one, it sits there, but also might be better equipped to handle that bottleneck. Generally, relationships between accountants and clients could be longer term. So it's one way of moving a bottleneck, but also focusing on our, some of our biggest strengths on the technology side and on the tax credit side. So yeah, I think, everyone being aware of what you can do with a bottleneck, putting it in potentially different places to make us more effective for our clients.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sure.
Sorry, was someone saying something?
No.
I was just going to say, so say we were to split the fee 50-50 with the accountants,
Yeah.
I would absolutely say that I spend 50% of my time trying to chase the initial information. So as long as we can increase the number of clients by 50%, then that will work out good.
Exactly. It's
more than 50%.
Yeah, but I mean, yeah.
But this is right, the whole thing about, this kind of engaging with the workflow, this idea of working at the system level, that it's an ongoing thing. It means that we want to, I think it will be helpful to us, to, we want to, I don't know what we want. How could I possibly know what, in the words of Whitnell, how could I possibly know what we should do? No, but what I think would be helpful to us is if we A/B test this stuff to say, okay, if we put a batch of clients through an adjusted workflow in which the chasing is taken out of our system and given to someone else, what does this do in terms of the revenue that we get? And there are some, so this is where the throughput accounting starts to come in, where you start to say, actually, for the amount that we've outlaid, how much are we able to service from end to end? Because one of the crucial things about throughput accounting is it recognizes the truth of the fact that, work has no value to you until the point at which you invoice. So in the jargon of theory of constraints, that's the date of sale, right? The date on which a thing that the client actually has to pay for is sent out into the world. Because up until then, you haven't really made the sale because there's no income to realize. So it's a basis of accounting it's a kind of management accounting that allows you to look at realizing sale at the point at which work is delivered. It gives you some useful thinking about how you can experiment and understand whether or not you're increasing the efficiency of the process.
From my previous experience working in an accounting firm, I'd say 50% of my time there was chasing clients as well. What sort of measures have we got in place to make sure that it is worthwhile that they're doing the chasing side, and why are they necessarily going to be more successful than us chasing them?
So basically, a lot of the things we're chasing a client for could be things that it's like, can you get your bookkeeper to give us this? We don't want their accountant to give it to us because they're quite expensive. But their accountant might well know it, possibly knows it better. But if the accountant is also involved in the success fee, their impetus is obviously to claim it as fast as possible. They have access to these numbers. They know their clients possibly better because generally the client will know their accountant before they've ever met us. And so there's a good relationship there. There's knowledge on the numbers side that we need. So if an accountant knows those numbers, they don't even have to chase. It's us chasing an accountant, like you say.
Yeah.
So potentially they have a lot of that information. And as long as they're properly incentivized, whatever they want, reduced fees for their clients for better service, commissions, whatever it is, if we structure that correctly, it's like advance payment or tax credits payment.
Anyone else? No? Okay, cool beans. I think Joanna has or Pippa has